doing Jehovah Sabaoth. I've had to learn how to pronounce that. Is this echoing a bit? Do you want me to speak? Okay. All right. Okay, let's get started. Now then, I really think Bethany wanted to do this study. You did, didn't you? Yes. And she was very gracious to let me do it. But I've been so blessed studying this. It's just really, really spoken to me all the way through. And I just hope that it speaks to you as well, just as much as it has me. I think sometimes when you really get into studying, it's for you. So, as we know, the word Lord refers to Jehovah, the self-existent, redemptive God. And the word host is translated from the word Sabaoth. I have to keep practicing that, meaning armies. And it's a reference to the angelic armies of heaven. Another way of saying Lord of hosts is God of the angel armies. So this name denotes his universal sovereignty over every army, both spiritual and earthly. I think you will agree that there seems to be an awful lot of battles, isn't there, in this world, and especially for the Christian. After all, the devil isn't going to bother too much about those in the world. We know ourselves that we get attacked this way and that way. We face spiritual battles daily. And if it's battles of the mind, discouragement, maybe it's a battle to push through in areas we find difficult. Maybe it's a battle to pray. Sometimes we just fall asleep and we have to push through. Battle to keep our eyes on God when we're going through difficult situations, difficult times in our life. It's still that battle to know that God is in control and to keep our eyes firmly fixed on him. The Lord of Hosts occurs approximately 261 times in the Old Testament. In fact, it is mentioned many times throughout the prophets connected with battles. I know when I first knew I was going to do this, naturally you go through the Bible looking up the Lord of Hosts and it pops up everywhere. And just about every one, it's to do with a battle. So the Lord of Hosts is first mentioned in Samuel 1:3. We'll be turning to that. That's our next one. So I've picked out three sort of different examples for us to look at tonight. And the first is the story of Hannah and her torment and vow to the Lord, which took place in Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. So if you'd just like to turn to 1 Samuel 1, and we'll read through. So verse 1. There was a certain man of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. This man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of Hosts in Shiloh. And whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival also provoked Hannah severely to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it was, year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, that she provoked her, and that she did not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? So Hannah arose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul, and she prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. So all the times I've read this, I really seem to have missed the point somehow. I'm just always focusing on the fact that Hannah was desperate for a child. She was desperate for a son. She felt incomplete, and she just so wanted a baby. And I'm sure anyone that has been in that position would understand that, sometimes we just really want to be a mother. And Hannah, she just felt incomplete in this area. But I just couldn't understand why she prayed the Lord of hosts. Well, why would you pray that? And she began her prayer, didn't she, by calling on the name of the Lord of hosts, referring to the Lord of the mighty armies. And I'm just going to read this bit again. It says in verse 11, Then she said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me. And affliction is the word here, isn't it? Hannah's affliction was double-fold, because she desired a son, and she also wanted relief from her tormentor. And it was a desperate cry, wasn't it, from Hannah, as she called on the Lord of the mighty armies to protect her. That was just such a revelation to me, to call on the name of the Lord of hosts during times of personal attack. And it just gives power to our prayers. As Hannah prayed in that name, her prayer was answered. God gave her the desire of her heart, and no doubt the attacks from her enemy would end. Now, we may not suffer many attacks as Hannah did, from people, but we can be sure of one thing, and that is that the enemy will come in and try and destroy us one way or another. And it says in Ephesians 6:11, we are instructed to put on the whole armour of God. And in verse 18, it says, praying at all times in the Spirit. And I believe this is an effective way to pray in the name of the Lord of hosts. It certainly worked for Hannah. It stopped the torment, and it stopped all that grief by praying to the Lord of hosts, because she gave this horrible situation that she was in to the Lord, and he fought that battle for her. So if you'd like to turn, we're going into another one now. We're going to do David's defeat of Goliath. So if you turn to 1 Samuel 17, starting in verse 2. And I know this is a Sunday school story, but I feel like often we can overlook the amazing power of God and David's faith in the Lord. So reading from verse 2. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they camped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels. He had bronze armor on his legs and between his shoulders. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So who wouldn't be greatly afraid of Goliath? So he was quite the giant, 8'5" to 9'2". And that would be, I'm guessing, about 3 feet above the door there. Quite a size. And we know he had a big head because of his arrogance. And literally, his head must have been massive. And his voice, if you can imagine his voice, it would have just boomed. You know, he could have frightened everybody by his voice. It would have been deafening. His coat of mail weighed 5,000 shekels alone, which would be about 167 pounds. Quite a lot. His spearhead weighed 600 shekels, which was about 18 pounds. A fearful sight indeed, if you can just imagine that man with just roaring over the Israeli army. He just must have terrified them all, just bringing fear upon Saul and Israel. So it was not surprising there were no volunteers to go and fight this giant. See, Goliath was a winner before he'd even started to fight. He'd won on fear alone. Saul had once been a great and successful military leader, but that was before the Spirit of the Lord had left him. So Saul is now full of fear and not trusting the Lord. So day after day, Goliath taunted and mocked the army of Israel, exposing them, and especially Saul, as cowards. There was not one man among them that would take on Goliath. So David enters the scene now, and it's not by chance. God always has a plan for good. No matter how much the enemy tells you otherwise, God has a good plan. So David's father Jesse asked David to take provisions to his brothers and to bring back word that they were well. So Saul was becoming pretty desperate at this time. He really wanted to wipe out this giant, so he offered his daughter's hand in marriage and free taxes to anyone who would conquer this giant. David, not the big head or loudmouth, like Goliath, he was so close to God, he knew this giant could be defeated. And his focus was not on the material rewards, it was to honor the living God and the reputation of Israel. So he saw the problem in spiritual terms and not in material. It says in Ephesians 6:12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, and against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Chuck Smith says, "It is important for us to realize that we are in a spiritual battle. Satan often uses wily tactics to make us believe we are battling against flesh and blood. If Satan can draw you into the flesh, then he has a decided advantage over you. But if we fight against him in the spirit, with the spiritual resources and the armor of God provides, we can't lose. So it's vital that we understand the spiritual nature of all our conflicts." So this was where the spiritual battle was won. David was not in this for his own glory, but in it to give God the glory. So after a fair amount of discouragement from his brothers, David presented himself to Saul to fight this wretched giant. However, Saul was concerned for David's safety, and being in the flesh, offered protection by giving him his own armor to wear. But God had David covered. And I just was reading through this tonight and just saw something fresh again. And Goliath, early on we read, Goliath had a shield bearer go before him. I mean, he was a huge guy, and then he has a shield bearer. But David, he had the Lord of hosts, didn't he, to go before him. He didn't need a shield bearer. And, from the world's point of view, Goliath had everything going for him. So let's pick up again in verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the giant. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's." This is where I find myself cheering David on. I just love justice, and I always want to see the bad guy come a cropper. I always want to see him down, and I get so excited when I read that. I'm just like, yes, you go, David, you go. But imagine Goliath, this huge warrior, full of self-importance, and he was so insulted, wasn't he? And angry to see this youth in front of him, to fight him with stones and a sling. "Am I a dog?" he says. He truly thought he was worth a better opponent. David makes a contrast between himself and Goliath and his armor and his weapons, and David comes to fight in the name of the Lord. The God who has heavenly armies at his command, it's no contest, is it? David had complete trust in God, that God would win this battle, and he did. He knew that the battle belonged to the Lord, and he wanted all the earth to know that. And that he wanted them all to know that he was with him, and that he is fighting our battles too. Even times when we're not aware of it, he is fighting our battles. David refers to the Lord of hosts many times throughout his life, and particularly in the Psalms. There's many, many references in the Psalms where David speaks of the Lord of hosts, but I picked out one that I think is particularly good, and it's Psalm 24, 8-10, and I'll just read it to you because it's just a few lines. It says, "Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts, he is the King of glory." David, the mighty man of battle, gives the Lord of hosts all the glory. He does not take any credit. In fact, he is so full of praise, he is saying, "Lift up, O doors, and let the King of glory in." We need to let the King of glory in to fight our battles, that we too can give him the praise and the glory. Now, the third example is in 2 Kings 6, if you would like to turn there. And this describes a heavenly army of angels to protect Elisha. Starting in verse 8. Now the king of Syria was making war against Israel, and he consulted with his servant, saying, "My camp will be in a certain place." And the man of God sent to the king of Israel, saying, "Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are coming down there." Then the king of Israel sent someone to the place of which the man of God told him. So he warned him, so that he saved himself more than once or twice. Therefore the heart of the king of Syria was greatly troubled, and he called his servants and said to them, "Will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel?" And one of his servants said, "None, my lord, but Elisha the prophet, who is in Israel, tells the king the words you speak in your bedroom." So he said, "Go see where he is, that I may send and seize him." And it was told him, "Surely he is in Dothan." Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army. They came by night, and they surrounded the city. And when the servant of Elisha, the man of God, arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" So he answered, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed and said, "Lord, open his eyes that he may see." And then the Lord opened his eyes, the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. The king of Syria was doing his best to make war against Israel, but his plans were ruined every single time. It would seem that Israel was always one step ahead. It's how annoying for the king of Syria. He was absolutely convinced that he had a traitor in his midst. So we have a little bit of Old Testament espionage in the form of Elisha here. So imagine being so close to God, we would know the enemy's next move. That the enemy could be stopped even before an attack. But that's where Elisha was at. And just imagine that. Just imagine knowing and just being able to go and say, watch this. This is what's happening. So the king decided he was going to put an end to this by capturing Elisha. So when the servant saw the army surrounding the city, he was absolutely full of fear. And who wouldn't be? And of course Elisha said, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are far more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed to open the eyes that he may see. And what a miraculous sight. If only we could see God's angel armies. The horses and chariots represented the divine power, and their fiery nature showed their supernatural origin. David Guzik says, "The eyes of faith see the reality of the divine presence and protection, where it is just darkness to the ordinary eye." We see many accounts, don't we, of angels throughout the Bible sent by the Lord of the host to protect and deliver us. It says in Psalm 34:7, "The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them." In Daniel 6:22, "My God sent an angel and shut the lions' mouths." In Exodus 14:19, "The angel of God went before the camp of Israel, protecting them." In Judges 6:11, it says, "The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor.'" And in Acts 5:19, "But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out." So, does God send his angels to protect us in the 21st century? Well, yes, I think he does, even though we don't always see them. I don't know if any of you have read this. I know Bethany's seen the DVD, but there's a book called Prisoners of Hope. I haven't read the book, but I've seen the DVD, and it's about two young women, Heather Mercer and Dana Corrie. They went to Afghanistan in 2001 as missionaries, and during that time they were captured and put into prison for teaching Christianity to a local family. They were imprisoned for 3.5 months. It was an absolutely terrible time. I'm not got down here all the details, but I hope that you get the book and read it or watch the DVD. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. There's no doubt about it that God rescued or sent his angels. I just believe he did. And anyway, they were in prison for 3.5 months, and they were put on trial, and they were threatened with execution. And when they were rescued by the anti-Taliban forces, they broke into the prison and just opened the doors. And that was the thing that I remember when she was talking about it, that it was like they just walked in. There was no one there to put up any resistance, and they just walked out into the streets. And I can remember actually it being on the news about this, and obviously the two Americans, and it was big news that they'd been rescued, actually by the military, eventually. And they made such a big deal about it, but of course we heard nothing about the Lord in all this, and it was the Lord that actually rescued them. And so I believe, truthfully, that the angel armies were there to help them get out of the prison. So I can definitely recommend you reading that. It's so encouraging. And so the sovereign Lord of hosts, Sabaoth, will always be there for us when we come to him through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, the King of glory, who commands the armies of heaven and who will eventually defeat all his enemies in this world, is none other than Jesus Christ, and he is the Lord of hosts. So shall we pray?